sober for over 400 days. Here's what actually changes in the human body and mind. If someone said that giving up alcohol for over 400 days could completely rearrange the human brain, restore biochemical balance, rebuild emotional stability, and expose hidden layers of identity, most people in their 20s or 30s would scoff. Alcohol is stitched into culture so tightly that imagining a life without it feels extreme. Drinking is treated as celebration, coping mechanism, social lubricant, and evening routine all in one. Because of that, most people assume sobriety means deprivation, boredom, or isolation. Yet neuroscience tells a very different story. The truth is that long-term sobriety is not the removal of something pleasurable. It is the removal of a chemical that quietly rewires the nervous system, distorts reward pathways, disrupts sleep architecture, elevates stress hormones, alters gut function, and conditions the brain to depend on external stimulation. What remains after removing alcohol is not emptiness, but restoration. Many people avoid sobriety because they picture dramatic withdrawal, awkward social nights, and a life stripped of excitement. Others worry that quitting drinking means admitting a problem, even if the problem is subtle. But dependency doesn't always look chaotic. For most adults, it hides beneath socially acceptable behaviors. Nightly drinking to unwind, weekend binges considered normal, or subtle cravings at predictable hours. Alcohol occupies a strange space in society. It is the only drug where refusing it makes people suspicious. It is the only drug that requires an excuse to not consume it. This cultural normalization allows mild to moderate dependency to grow unnoticed and unchallenged for years. But something profound happens when alcohol consumption stops. Biology begins to reveal just how much the body had been compensating behind the scenes. In the first weeks without alcohol, one of the most noticeable scientific shifts is the recalibration of dopamine pathways. Alcohol artificially increases dopamine, teaching the brain to associate relief, reward, and relaxation with a chemical trigger. Over time, this creates a fixed expectation, often around the same time each day, where the brain anticipates the reward before the drink even arrives. This conditioned response is not based on psychology alone. It is measurable through dopamine spikes in anticipation, not consumption. Removing alcohol interrupts that cycle, and the nervous system enters recovery mode. Dopamine receptors begin restoring sensitivity, a process that takes weeks but produces significant changes in clarity, motivation, and emotional stability. Another major change occurs in the stress system. Alcohol initially reduces stress by boosting GABA, a calming neurotransmitter. But the brain compensates by increasing excitatory chemicals like glutamate. When drinking stops, GABA drops and glutamate remains high temporarily, a state that produces restlessness, irritability, light anxiety, and difficulty sleeping. This isn't weakness. It's neurochemical turbulence. It's the brain relearning how to regulate itself without sedation. By the third week, cognitive fog begins lifting. Alcohol disrupts REM sleep, a critical phase where memory consolidates and emotional processing occurs. Once alcohol is removed, REM sleep rebounds, increasing mental sharpness and decreasing fatigue. The return of natural sleep cycles is one of the most profound effects of sobriety. Improved REM sleep alone enhances decision-making, creativity, emotional resilience, and metabolic function. Many expect dramatic physical changes, instant weight loss, or sharper facial features. But biology isn't always that immediate. While body composition may not shift dramatically in the first months, internal physiology changes rapidly, inflammatory markers decline. Liver enzymes normalize. Mitochondria, the cell's energy generators, begin functioning more efficiently. The immune system rebounds. Energy increases not because sobriety is magical, but because the body is no longer fighting nightly dehydration, disrupted hormones, or prolonged metabolic slowdown. Instead of spending days recovering from 6 hours of drinking, energy levels stabilize, cognitive output improves, and physical performance increases. The absence of hangovers doesn't just remove discomfort, it removes biochemical debt. One of the most underestimated changes is mental clarity. Around 3 to 4 weeks of sobriety, many people report a return of what feels like youthful sharpness. This improvement is grounded in neuroscience. Alcohol reduces the brain's ability to maintain neurotransmitter balance and slows communication between neural networks. Removing it allows the prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning and impulse control, to regain strength. This sharpening effect is so common that the sober community has a name for it: the fog lifting. Scientifically, this corresponds to improved glucose metabolism in the brain, normalized cortisol patterns, deeper sleep cycles, and increased synaptic efficiency. Another significant transformation appears in mood regulation. Alcohol is a numbing agent. It suppresses emotional signals, masks unresolved pain, and artificially elevates mood. When alcohol is removed, the full emotional landscape returns. This can be uncomfortable at first, but it is also the beginning of real healing. Without intoxication to mute discomfort, unresolved insecurities, anxieties, childhood wounds, self-criticism, and suppressed emotions rise to the surface. This is not a setback. It is the removal of an anesthetic that prevented emotional processing. Long-term sobriety forces deeper psychological work that alcohol previously paused. This emotional resurfacing is what leads to the next major benefit: genuine confidence. Confidence is often misunderstood as boldness or extroversion. The root meaning of confidence is to trust. Trusting oneself becomes easier when decisions are consistent, when mood is stable, and when promises to the self are not broken by hangovers, impulse drinking, or emotional swings. Each day without alcohol strengthens internal credibility. Discipline becomes easier. Habits stabilize, emotional reactions decrease. Self-respect grows because the self is no longer undermined by unpredictable chemistry. Over time, this creates a different form of confidence. Not loud confidence, but grounded confidence. Sobriety also creates time, more than most people expect. Without sluggish mornings, delayed productivity, slowed thinking, or recovery days, many individuals discover they have hours of additional usable time. Work becomes faster. Focus increases. Tasks that once took all day shrink into efficient blocks. This surplus time exposes another shift: boredom. Many adults use alcohol to fill silence or occupy unstructured evenings. When alcohol is removed, those hours become visible. This boredom is not negative. It is space. It's an invitation for identity to rebuild, for hobbies to return, and for new interests to form. Social dynamics also change. Many fear that quitting drinking will destroy social life. Yet most find that modern alternatives, non-alcoholic beverages, zero-alcohol beers, sparkling water rituals, allow participation without intoxication. Social presence actually increases because memory, emotional engagement, and self-awareness are no longer dulled. However, certain environments, especially holidays or high-pressure gatherings, expose how deeply alcohol has been used for emotional regulation. Sobriety reveals this with brutal honesty. But it also teaches new coping strategies: breath work, reflection, emotional maturity, and genuine connection. The most powerful transformation of extended sobriety emerges in the realm of self-awareness. Alcohol functions like a pacifier for emotional discomfort, a chemical that temporarily silences insecurity, overthinking, unresolved trauma, loneliness, and internal criticism. When removed for long enough, these unresolved layers reappear and demand recognition. This is the beginning of internal healing. Without alcohol numbing discomfort, individuals begin asking deeper questions. Why do I only feel valuable when I'm achieving? Why do I avoid being alone with my thoughts? Why do certain people drain or trigger me? Why do I feel unworthy without external validation? Sobriety creates the internal space required to confront these questions. It becomes a form of shadow work, not mystical, but psychological. The nervous system finally has the stability to process unresolved patterns instead of suppressing them. Over time, sobriety becomes less about removing alcohol and more about recovering the self. Once alcohol has been absent long enough for the body to stabilize, something deeper begins, something that no blood test can measure. It is the point where biology and identity collide. Most people imagine sobriety as a physical detox or a self-discipline challenge. But long-term sobriety rewires the emotional, psychological, and neurological architecture of a person. What emerges is not a new self, but the version of the self that alcohol had been muting. The first major transformation after months of sobriety is emotional reactivation. Alcohol numbs difficult feelings, stress, insecurity, anxiety, unresolved memories, not by fixing them, but by silencing them temporarily. When alcohol is removed, those suppressed signals return. This is often misinterpreted as emotional instability, but scientifically, it is the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and limbic system re-establishing natural communication. Emotions begin to surface in fuller detail. Irritation that had been softened before. Sadness that was previously drowned out. Discomfort that had been blurred. This resurfacing is not regression. It is recovery. The nervous system is relearning emotional regulation without chemical interference. Unlike the dullness of intoxication, these emotions now arrive with clarity. People begin to notice exactly why a certain situation makes them anxious or why a certain relationship triggers defensiveness. Sobriety shines a bright light on patterns that were previously hidden behind fog. And with this clarity comes the second major transformation: introspection. Without alcohol acting as an escape mechanism, the mind finally notices the thoughts, beliefs, and self-judgments that used to get drowned out every evening. This is where real psychological work begins. Individuals start becoming aware of the inner critic, the perfectionism, the self-rejection, the buried shame, or the old wounds that alcohol kept temporarily quiet. This stage is often described as shadow work. And although it sounds mystical, there is a biological explanation. Alcohol blunts activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reflection, error detection, and emotional evaluation. After months without alcohol, this region becomes active again, heightening awareness of internal patterns that were previously ignored. During this period, people confront questions they've avoided for years. Why is self-worth tied to external accomplishments? Why is there discomfort with silence or stillness? Why is it easier to numb than to process? Why is compassion offered to others but denied to oneself? Sobriety is a mirror, and many discover that the parts of themselves they assumed were healed were merely anesthetized. The third major transformation is in identity. Alcohol often becomes part of how people define themselves. The fun one, the party person, the social drinker, the one who can handle a lot. When alcohol is removed, these identity labels dissolve, forcing a re-examination of who someone is without intoxication. This can be uncomfortable. Without alcohol to create artificial confidence or looseness, people begin rebuilding natural confidence from the ground up. The process is neurochemical. Dopamine regulation stabilizes, serotonin production improves, and cortisol patterns normalize. With this shift, self-trust begins forming again. Confidence becomes something earned through consistency rather than borrowed from intoxication. It no longer comes from disinhibition, but from grounded self-respect. The fourth transformation involves time, specifically the huge amount of time sobriety creates. Alcohol not only steals hours through drinking, it steals hours through recovery, sluggishness, and cognitive impairment. Once those hours are restored, many people realize how much potential was being wasted. Tasks that once took a full afternoon now take 2 focused hours. Projects that once seemed overwhelming become manageable. The increase in productivity is not motivational. It is neurological, with alcohol no longer destabilizing neurotransmitters. Executive functioning improves dramatically. Working memory becomes sharper. Focus becomes sustained. Decision-making becomes faster. Creativity increases. Emotional regulation stabilizes. This combination gives people additional hours of usable time every single day. And that leads to something unexpected: boredom. For many adults, drinking fills emotional and temporal gaps. Without it, life suddenly has empty space. That space forces psychological growth because it can no longer be filled with numbing or distraction. People rediscover old hobbies, learn new skills, reorganize their environment, invest in their passions, or re-engage with neglected parts of themselves. This boredom is not a sign of missing alcohol. It is evidence of a nervous system finally operating at full capacity. The fifth transformation appears socially. Alcohol changes how humans connect. It lowers inhibitions by suppressing the prefrontal cortex and increasing dopamine, creating the illusion of instant friendship or deep connection. When alcohol is removed, socializing becomes more intentional. At first, there is discomfort. Social settings feel sharper, more vivid, more demanding. But the presence that sobriety creates is far more authentic. People begin to notice nuances in conversation, remember details more clearly, connect on deeper levels, and observe relational dynamics that were previously blurred. Sobriety also reveals the relationships that were formed solely through intoxication. Social circles shift, not because sobriety isolates, but because sobriety filters people who only bond through drinking naturally drift away. People who resonate emotionally, intellectually, and energetically move closer. A sixth transformation emerges during holidays, family gatherings, and stressful events. These environments traditionally associate alcohol with relaxation, celebration, and emotional cushioning. Without alcohol, these moments expose emotional maturity levels directly. Instead of relying on intoxication to tolerate family dynamics or reduce anxiety, people begin developing new tools, breathwork, communication skills, boundaries, and emotional awareness. This new approach creates resilience. Emotional tolerance increases because the brain is no longer dependent on sedation to cope. The seventh transformation is the most profound: psychological integration. Alcohol separates the individual from themselves. It creates a disconnect between the emotional brain and the reasoning brain, delaying the processing of pain, insecurity, and stress. After long-term sobriety, the mind begins integrating suppressed experiences. Forgiveness becomes possible, not only for others, but for oneself. Self-compassion increases because the nervous system is no longer inflamed or chemically unstable. People stop evaluating themselves solely by productivity or achievement and begin valuing character, intention, and authenticity. Long-term sobriety also dismantles the conditional self-worth model many adults carry. Instead of valuing oneself only when achieving or performing, individuals begin recognizing inherent worth, something alcohol had quietly numbed for years. This is not spiritual fluff. It is the psychological result of a stable dopamine system, balanced cortisol, and restored emotional receptors. Perhaps the most powerful outcome of extended sobriety is this: clarity becomes more rewarding than intoxication. The brain stops associating alcohol with pleasure because the natural reward system has been repaired. Simple things, breakthroughs at work, deep conversations, early mornings, clarity of thought, begin producing dopamine that no longer requires artificial stimulation. Sobriety stops being a sacrifice and becomes a baseline that feels better than anything alcohol ever provided. After more than 400 days, the conclusion becomes unmistakable. Sobriety does not give a person a new life. It reveals the one that alcohol had been blocking. What begins as a detox becomes a neurological reconstruction. What begins as a challenge becomes a psychological rebirth. What begins as discomfort becomes clarity. And if someone is even slightly curious whether sobriety could change their life, there is only one way to find out. Try it for 30 days. Not forever. Not as punishment, but as an experiment in experiencing the nervous system the way it was designed to function. Some people go back after the challenge. Some never do. But almost everyone agrees on one universal truth. Life feels different, clearer, sharper, lighter, when the brain is finally allowed to operate without chemical interference.